The Human Development Institute hosts the State of HDI podcast. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and may not reflect the views of the University of Kentucky. A downloadable transcript is available in the description. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on the State of HDI, a podcast of the University of Kentucky Human Development Institute. This is Patty Singleton. With me in the studio is Jackie Kearns, Program Director of Communication Initiatives. Jackie has spent her career as a champion of students with significant disabilities and ensuring all students have access to communication. Jackie, welcome.
Thank you, Patty. I'm glad to be here.
To start, tell us what communication is, and specifically AAC, which is Augmentative and Alternative Communication.
So for my communication partners at Communication Sciences and Disorders at the University of Kentucky, communication is the conveyance of a message through a variety of methods. Facial expressions, body language, behavior, speech, sign language, texting, or speech-generating devices. Think about the time when you used a facial expression to communicate a message. Did you smile at someone to let them know you're happy, or did you give that mom or dad look? Your facial expressions to communicate a message. The important part of the conveyance of the message is that it's understood by the communication partner. AAC is any method that augments, improves the communication partner's understanding of the message. Everyone communicates. That's a common misconception. Persons who are non-speaking, or for those who use speech but struggle with complex communication functions like telling a story. I might not be able to make the words, sound the words to tell the story. The use of AAC improves the probability that their message will be understood. And also, it's kind of important to know that understanding language is not the same thing as being able to convey a message. People who are non-speaking often understand the language. They understand what you're asking them. They know they want to tell you something. They just have a hard time getting that message understood or formed through speech. Lots of language pathways, receptive pathways are things like vision, hearing, tactile pathways. So we can understand language in a variety of forms too. I used to have a former colleague who was an AAC user, and we would participate in virtual meetings, and he would actually text me his message, which is his answer to, or his participation in the meeting, so that I would read it to the group. That seemed to be efficient and effective for him. It gave him time to put the message together. So if you use a speech-generating device, you have to find the words, or you have to type the words, and then you have to send them. So that allowed him a method for communicating that made him understood, conveyed his thoughts and ideas, but I would say them for him. So, and it didn't sound like a message generated out of a device, but he preferred to do it that way. So being a good communication partner is a really important part of communication, but it's having that understood message that's really important in terms of being a communication partner.
I think that's a really great summary. And, as a parent and as a colleague, we've had to really learn new communication methods, especially after the pandemic and figuring out what virtual meetings are. And I love the point that you made about, the chat, because it is such a great way to communicate. And especially when not everyone has the chance to have, oral time or time to respond. And the chat has really become this great place to have kind of sidebar conversations. So yes, so great summary of that. So next, it's easy to take communication and especially verbal communication for granted. So why is communication important?
Wow, that's a really important question. Communication is absolutely necessary for social engagement, relationships, family, friends, health and safety. If you can't tell the doctor what's wrong or where it's wrong or what hurts or why you feel a certain way or that you feel a certain way, it's really detrimental to your health and safety. And those are things that people can't do for you. They can say, well, I think it hurts over here, or I think it's his tooth on the right side. Not being able to tell that your teeth are hurting is really a difficult thing. I actually had a friend once that had abscessed teeth but couldn't tell anybody that her teeth were abscessed. So the only way you could figure it out was if you watched her eat. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it was really difficult to tell, and she couldn't tell us. So can you imagine living for weeks with abscessed teeth? So that's just a really important reason. But then there are also things like access to employment and community engagement. It's really difficult to go to work if people don't know how you communicate, or you can't communicate that you need something, or that you communicate to your boss that you're finished or you need the next task. Communication for work is really important, as well as community engagement. How are you going to go to parties? How are you going to participate? If people can't understand what your views, your ideas, your talents are, that's really important. Also, self-determination and being able to make decisions for yourself, choice and control in any decisions. If you can't tell somebody that, yes, that's what I want, or no, that's not what I want, or no, don't do that again, then you are pretty much limited to having other people control your life, where you live, what you do, how you spend your time, what you have for dinner. They're making those decisions for you, and you aren't able to make them for yourself. And the thing that goes with all of those is positive post-school outcomes. If you don't have communication, you're not going to have a job when you leave. You're not going to go to higher education or onto a new learning activity because you don't have communication. In fact, you could honestly say that you've wasted about 12 years of your life because you didn't learn the things in school that we go to school to learn. Or you may have learned them, but you can't tell anybody that you know. And that's a really, really important thing. So this brings me to the story about Jordan Zimmerman. She's AAC user and board chairman for Communication First, and she identifies as autistic. And she says, for centuries, people with significant speech disabilities have treated us as if we should be seen, not be seen or heard. Our ability, right, and basic need to express ourselves have been routinely overlooked and denied. Well, if I don't have words, then I must not have any words, kind of like. Our words have been questioned because we do not use typical oral speech to express ourselves. We are discriminated against because others cannot or refuse to understand us. And we're often denied the tools and resources that we need to communicate. And those are some of the things. Her words are really, really important. Students need to be able to communicate and have their voices heard for all those reasons: social relationships, friendships, lifelong interactions, say health and safety, all those reasons. And if you haven't seen the film about Jordan's communication journey, I highly recommend This Is Not About Me, and encourage our listeners to give that a look.
We'll be sure to post a link to Jordan's movie, This Is Not About Me, in the show notes. So having lack of communication or no communication, it really would be very isolating and really kind of dangerous. So you mentioned the importance of communication for health and safety. I've noted multiple news stories reporting students being restrained and abused in school. So what role does communication play in these incidents?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because this is a really important thing that I think it gets missed often. There's a strong research base, believe it or not, that documents the direct relationship of the student's ability to communicate to the presence of problematic behavior. Well, if you didn't understand that I do not want that, I'm going to throw it at you because I do not want it. Well, we tend to consequate behavior and not respond to it as if it is communicative. And then it escalates, which results in restraint and seclusion of the student. And both of those things are dangerous. abuse and neglect, the U.S. Department of Justice estimates that for men and women with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they're already at 3 times the risk for physical abuse, 5 times the risk of sexual abuse, and for women, 8 times the risk of sexual abuse for women who are assaulted more than 10 times. This was documented by a special series on National Public Radio, Abused and Betrayed. And if the person is non-speaking, they can't tell what's happening to them. So the likelihood that that's going to happen will continue. So the being able to tell, and I'm telling family members that now, and I'm telling teachers this, being able to tell what happened to you, whether it's a good story or a bad story, but especially if it's something that someone is doing to hurt you, is incredibly important to be able to do. So it has a significant, communication has a significant role in protecting students and individuals who are not speaking from abuse and neglect and restraint and seclusion.
You talked earlier about the post-school success of students having the communication devices. So can you talk about a little bit more about the research behind that?
Right. Communicating effectively, as I mentioned earlier, is essential to post-school success. That's heavily documented in the literature. And students with the most significant cognitive disabilities have poorer post-school outcomes than all other students with disabilities. And research, according to our own Dr. Harold Kleinert, suggests that they have the poorest post-school outcomes of all, and meaning that they have limited job restrictions, limited community involvement, limited friendship, social relationships as a whole.
So as you mentioned, HDI has led many of those studies. So what does the data say about communication nationally and in Kentucky?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because we've been looking at the communication data now for, about 15 years. And actually that started the first communication project. The TALK project started as a result of the findings of the communication data for the population of students who participate in alternate assessments. And what's important about that is that those are first assessed in 3rd grade. So the student is 8 years old when we're first looking at their data, right? And what we found is, which was surprising at the time, this has been about 15 years ago, the first study was, and we found it in multiple states because it was a part of the National Alternate Assessment Project. So other states used our tool to look at their data. But while the majority of students who participate in alternate assessments do use verbal speech, we have about 21% of that population who use single words, and we have about 8% who use natural behaviors or involuntary behaviors. They have no formal communication method that is understood by their communication partner, unless the communication partner is very watchful and interpretive. And often that is not the case. So although they may be intentionally communicating, parents and caregivers observe and interpret those behaviors to determine what the child may want or need. Most of the time, however, given some wait time, what appears to be intentional is unintentional is intentional. And I give this story. A few years ago, we visited a high school student who didn't have a formal communication system, and I went with another Dr. Kleinert, Dr. Jane Kleinert, and we asked this student to raise his hand. And he has really complex motor disabilities. And the moment Dr. Kleinert asked him to raise his hand, I started counting in my head, 1001, 1002, 1003. When I got to 1008, he raised his hand. The way communication works in our natural world, we talk really fast, and we tend to ask way more often and we wait less. So waiting more, asking less is definitely the way to go. But also we wanted to give that student a way to communicate that was more than eye gaze. We eventually were able to use that eye gaze to give him a more robust communication system. But if people weren't waiting and looking really carefully, they would have missed that looking to my right is yes, and looking to the left maybe a little bit is no. And that's really, really complex. What's also important to know about these data is kids we found it in 8-year-olds, but we also found it in 17-year-olds. And all throughout the grades, that 8% doesn't change much at all. And so that means that kids are coming to school without it. That means kindergarten through 3rd grade, they're still coming to school without it, even though the literature says never too early, never too late. Some people think, oh, well, I'm going to wait because if I give them a device, they won't talk. That's absolutely not true. Devices help kids talk mainly because it slows us down.
Right.
So more recently, we've looked at the data, and it's pretty much the same. It hasn't changed an awful lot. In the past, I think people are identifying kids better. They're making better decisions about who is a symbolic language user, who's emerging, and who still needs more words or symbols, or a way to use symbols and get AAC. But and so it's dropped a little bit, but we still have kids coming to school and leaving school without it. In addition, we know that for adults, about 2% use some sign language, and that's not sign language as in ASL. This is 1 or 2 words like want, more, yes, no, those very simple 1-word kinds of things, that signs for 1 words. The problem with signs is that most of their communication partners may or may not know, especially communication partners may or may not know what those signs mean, and they can't use them to tell what happened last night. Or they use gestures, and only about 1% of the adults in the National Core Indicator study here in Kentucky had any sort of AAC device. And then to further complicate all of that, we have kids who are English learners who are also AAC users or are potential AAC users. So last year in our ECHO, we had a high school student who was bilingual and using eye gaze. And actually, the eye gaze wasn't working for her. So we got an auditory scanning tool for her to be able to scan. And we encouraged the team to have both English and her home language on her communication device so she can communicate in both worlds. And that's really important. You want both worlds. So the data is kind of we're not the only state that has this problem. Other states do too, but it seems endemic. It seems like, why do we still have this problem?
Right. So tell me, what works with students without verbal communication? Is there research to support intervention strategies to improve those communication outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that. There's 20 years of research that says intervention works. Over 116 studies now. There's probably more like 125 studies now. Dr. Kleiner, Dr. Page, and I are still working on a paper about students who are included, and the research is really pretty good in terms of the strategies that work. Intervention itself works. When a team intervenes and they all work together, that works. And they can get a system, and that includes family members. So communication interventions, remembering that the device isn't the only way we communicate, that if they communicate through their signs and their eye gaze and you understand that and it speaks to you, great, but don't forget they have to be able to tell. So our communication purposes, they might do well with those things at home because mom and dad can figure that out, but they're not going to be able to use that. They might be able to use that at school, but they're not going to be able to use that in community settings. So they have to be able to have a more robust communication system. Aided language modeling. Just like we speak to young children in slow words and when they're babies and we give them lots of hours, we have to start early with those communication devices and we have to model how to use them. You can't just hand it to them and them automatically know how to use it. So, and that's also a common misunderstanding. Oh, if I give them a device, they'll just know how to use it. No, mainly because devices are, as I mentioned earlier, not really efficient. And And so we have to make it efficient for them. It has to be efficient and effective for them to be able to use it. And the only way that happens is if we model. We use it too. We have to do it with them. Peers are awesome. Peer-mediated supports help with communication. So access to peers who can model on a communication device. Peers also are very observant and probably better communication partners because they haven't learned stuff that probably blinds us in some ways to what a person is communicating or that they are communicating. And then, as I mentioned, the teamwork and collaboration, the speech-language pathologist, the educator, the parent, the OT, the PT, especially if the student has really complex needs. So those are the things that work, and they're very well documented.
So of all that research, has it translated into policy?
Well, that's an interesting one. Probably, as Jordan Zimmerman suggests, not enough. She's working on an advocacy level to improve what has happened. But in 2014, there was a Dear Colleague letter from OSEP and OSERS that says that students with a disability under ADA and IDE, students with disabilities under IDEA and ADA, we must ensure that a communication for a student with a disability is as effective as communication for a student without disability. Well, now think about that. It can't just be want more, selecting a choice, using a one-picture system. It has to be being able to tell what was in the story, who's my friend, what we did last night. They have to be able to communicate in a more robust way. I have to be able to share my ideas. I have to be able to share what I've learned, all of those things. So that was the policy guidance in 2014. Unfortunately, policy guidance is probably not, just through a Dear Colleague letter, is probably not enough really to make change. I also haven't seen anybody really pay that much attention to it, unfortunately. So hopefully Jordan's work and the work that we're continuing to do will help people make better decisions. There was a Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago about making, it didn't have to do with communication, but it had to do with adequate progress. And I would ask the question, how can you determine that a student has made adequate progress if they don't have a way to communicate effectively what they have learned? And I don't mean answer the question and point to the answer. I mean tell. I mean share. I mean interact. All of those things. If they don't have that, how can we say that they have an effective communication system?
So for those students who do require AAC, is it affordable?
Well, it's more affordable than it ever has been. Now, yes, our communication device is expensive. Some of them are. There are some lower tech devices. There are picture boards. I've mentioned sign language before, switches, dynamic or speech generating devices. But the important thing is, does the communication partner understand? And is it robust enough for the person to be able to tell? I'm just going to keep saying that. Is it robust enough for the person to be able to tell? Because if they can't tell, they may be getting through some basic decisions in life, but they're not going to have the kind of outcomes that we want, and they're not going to have the language development that we want. It's important to feature match hearing, vision, motor, and sensory capabilities. But, while some devices are very expensive, there are some that are very affordable and available and easy to get. So it's much more affordable than it ever has been before.
And so if we know it works, why does the problem persist?
Well, that's an important question too, and it's complicated, unfortunately. In a 2018 survey of American Speech and Hearing Association speech-language pathologists, 50% of the respondents indicated a lack of opportunity to collaborate as a major barrier. But they also identified a lack of training in AAC, assistive technology, and little understanding of low-incidence populations. So those are the kinds of things that for SLPs. And similarly, in trained special educators, when a student presents with complex needs that they have not encountered before, they feel less prepared in communication skills, AAC, and supporting physical, sensory, and medical needs. The more complicated the case, the less confident they feel in providing services to that student, as well as having time, as the SLPs report, to collaborate, because that collaboration is essential.
So tell us what training opportunities are available for teachers.
Right now, we have the ECHO and AAC, which we invite teachers to bring a case, and we'll help our interdisciplinary team, PT, OT, speech, vision, hearing, all those people, audiology, are on our team. We invite teams to bring a case, and we will problem solve with them and provide suggestions for them. We also do teaching presentations. We have a webinar series on communication, from everything from peer supports to working with teams directly to either through web, or we'll come to the school to do the SETS, Student Environment Task Tool framework, to identify the impacting factors and what might work for that particular student. And we have a core vocabulary webinar. So we have webinar series. We have the ECHO. We have online series that's asynchronous that you can join just by joining HDI Learning in their communication area. And so we have lots of materials and resources available out there. The pandemic hasn't made this any easier because it's online, but also teachers have less time. So we're looking for ways to make it more accessible and easier to get to.
And we'll certainly make sure that all those links are available in the show notes. So to wrap up, can you give an example of a student with successful communication?
Well, I have two examples maybe. One is the young man I was telling you about in the high school student who we were able to get a scanning system for to augment his eye gaze, which already was working okay. So we were able, and a peer engagement group. So he had peers to work with, and he had a new device, a scanning device, and he used a proximity switch, which is commonly called a candy corn switch. So all he had to do was barely move his head, and it would scan for him. And so that worked out pretty well. So that's a success story. And then I have a young student who came to that I work with actually in another state, who came to school in kindergarten with a communication device in his backpack, but he didn't want to get it out. And they went through a training that we provided in their state, and we've been coaching that team for 3 years. We show up to meetings through Zoom and help them problem solve. And he is now in 3rd grade, and he is using his device, and he's doing really, really well. So those are success stories. The Ohio one is kind of interesting because we've mitigated the problem. It's likely now that he will leave school with the device because he has ownership of it. His team gives him choice and control over when it's used and when it isn't used. And he will likely leave with it. Unfortunately for the high school student, will he leave with it? Only to the extent that his caregivers, because he's out of school now, his caregivers prioritize it.
Well, Jackie, I really appreciate you sitting down with us today, and I'm really hopeful about the additional practices and the training that we'll start to see some of those research numbers that you shared earlier improve over the years. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I am really passionate about making sure kids come to school with it and don't leave without it, because it's really, really a life-changing skill that we all need. Thanks for having me.